They say time heals all wounds. That's what people tell you when they don't know what else to say. They mean well, I suppose. But I'm 80 years old now, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that time doesn't heal. Time just teaches you how to carry the weight differently. Some days it feels lighter, like a shawl draped over your shoulders. Other days, it's a boulder pressing down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. Today, after 6 decades of silence, I've decided it's time to put this weight down. Not because I've forgiven, not because I've forgotten, but because my story deserves to be heard before I'm gone. My name is Eleanor Hayes, though that wasn't always my name. I've lived many lives, worn many faces, carried many secrets. But there's one secret that's been eating away at me like rust on old iron. And it's time I spoke it aloud. This is the story of how I survived 8 months in hell, how I became the Colonel's toy, and how I poisoned the monster who tried to break me. I need you to understand something before I begin. This isn't a story about revenge, though revenge was certainly part of it. This isn't a story about justice, because there was no justice to be found. This is a story about survival, about the lengths a human being will go to when pushed beyond the edge of what they thought possible. This is a story about discovering that the will to live can be stronger than any torture, any degradation, any attempt to strip away your humanity. I was 20 years old in 1965, working as a translator in a country I won't name, for reasons that will become clear. The war there was both official and unofficial, acknowledged in some circles and completely denied in others. I was young, idealistic, and convinced that my language skills could make a difference. I spoke 5 languages fluently by then: English, French, German, Spanish, and Portuguese. My parents had been diplomats, and I'd grown up moving from country to country, soaking up languages like a sponge absorbs water. The organization I worked for was supposed to be neutral, providing humanitarian aid and translation services to help civilian populations caught in the crossfire. We wore no uniforms, carried no weapons, and operated under the protection of international law. Or so we believed. How naive we were. How dangerously, fatally naive. I remember the last morning of my normal life with perfect clarity. It was a Tuesday, hot and humid, the kind of day where the air feels thick enough to chew. I'd had coffee and bread for breakfast, listening to the radio broadcast news I didn't fully understand about troop movements and political tensions. I wore a simple cotton dress, pale blue with small white flowers. I remember because later, when they took it from me, I mourned that dress as if it were an old friend. The streets were busy that morning, full of people going about their daily routines with determined normalcy, trying to pretend that the war wasn't closing in around them like a noose. Children played in doorways. Women hung laundry between buildings. Men sat in cafes, smoking and arguing about football. Life persisting in the face of death, the way it always does. I was walking to the office, my worn leather satchel slung over my shoulder, when the jeeps appeared. 3 of them, military green, moving fast through the narrow streets. People scattered like birds startled by a stone. I pressed myself against a wall, trying to make myself small, invisible. But they weren't interested in the crowd. They were interested in me. The jeep screeched to a halt. Soldiers poured out, their boots hitting the cobblestones with sounds like gunshots. Before I could run, before I could even think to run, rough hands grabbed me. My satchel fell to the ground, spilling papers and pens across the street. Someone was screaming. It took me a moment to realize it was me. They threw a hood over my head, and my world went dark. Hands pushed me into a vehicle. An engine roared. And then we were moving, and I was being carried away from everything I'd ever known, toward a nightmare I couldn't yet imagine. The journey felt endless. Without sight, without any sense of direction or time, panic consumes you. Your mind fills in the darkness with terrors. Every bump in the road sent jolts of fear through my body. I tried to keep track of time by counting seconds, but I kept losing count, kept forgetting where I was in my numbers. My breath came hot and fast inside the hood, and I worried I might suffocate before we even arrived at wherever they were taking me. When the vehicle finally stopped, they pulled me out roughly. My legs had gone numb from sitting in one position, and I stumbled. No one caught me. I fell hard onto gravel, skinning my knees through my dress. Someone laughed. That laugh, I can still hear it sometimes late at night when I can't sleep. It wasn't cruel exactly, just casual, indifferent, as if my pain was nothing more than a mildly amusing accident. They hauled me to my feet and marched me forward. I could hear sounds now that we'd stopped moving, generators humming, men's voices, a radio playing music that seemed obscenely cheerful. We went inside a building. I could tell by the way the sounds changed, became more enclosed and echoing. The temperature dropped. Concrete under my feet instead of gravel. Then we were descending. Stairs, lots of them. Down, down, down into what felt like the Earth's basement. The air grew colder and damper with each step. Finally, we stopped. I heard a metal door screech open, the sound making my teeth ache. Someone removed the hood. The light was blinding after the darkness. I squeezed my eyes shut, but that earned me a slap across the face that made my ears ring. When I finally forced my eyes open, blinking away tears, I saw where they'd brought me. A cell. Concrete walls, concrete floor, concrete ceiling. A single bare bulb hanging from a wire, casting harsh shadows. A bucket in one corner. A thin mattress on a metal frame. No windows. The door behind me was solid steel with a small slot at the bottom. And standing in front of me, studying me with the clinical interest of an entomologist examining an insect, was the man I would come to know simply as the Colonel. He was perhaps 40 years old, though it was hard to tell. His face had the kind of agelessness that comes from absolute certainty in one's own power. Average height, fit but not muscular, with dark hair graying at the temples. He wore a pristine uniform, every crease perfect, every button gleaming. His hands were manicured. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. He looked like he could have been attending a state dinner rather than standing in this underground prison. But his eyes gave him away. They were flat, emotionless, like a shark's eyes. When he looked at me, I didn't feel seen. I felt evaluated, assessed, catalogued. Eleanor Hayes, he said, his English perfect though accented. 20 years old. Translator. American citizen, though your parents were British. You've been in country for 6 months, working with the Refugee Relief Organization. He smiled, and it was worse than if he'd snarled at me. Did you really think we didn't know exactly who you were and what you were doing? I tried to speak, to protest that I was just a translator, that I was protected under international law, that there had been some terrible mistake. But no words came out. My mouth opened and closed uselessly, like a fish drowning in air. The Colonel circled me slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. You've been passing information to the resistance. Names, locations, supply routes. Don't bother denying it. We have evidence. We've been watching you for weeks. That's not true. I finally managed to whisper. I'm just a translator. I don't know anything about. He held up one hand, and I fell silent. Whether it's true or not is irrelevant, he said conversationally. What matters is that I need information, and you're going to give it to me. Your organization has been very useful to certain parties interested in undermining our government. You're going to tell me everything you know about their operations. I don't know anything, I said, my voice stronger now, anger beginning to cut through the fear. I translate documents. I help refugees fill out forms. I'm not a spy. The Colonel studied me for a long moment, then nodded as if confirming something to himself. Very well, he said. We'll see how long that story holds up. He walked to the door, then paused and looked back at me. Welcome to your new home, Miss Hayes. I suggest you make yourself comfortable. You're going to be here for quite some time. The door clanged shut. The lock turned. And I was alone. The first 3 days, they left me alone. No one came except to push thin soup and stale bread through the slot in the door. The light stayed on constantly, never dimming, never darkening. Sleep became impossible. I would doze fitfully, only to jerk awake with my heart pounding, disoriented and terrified. I tried to keep track of time by counting meals, but I quickly realized they weren't following any regular schedule. Sometimes food would come twice in what felt like a few hours. Other times, I would wait until I was weak with hunger before anything appeared. They were already breaking down my sense of reality, undermining my ability to orient myself. The isolation was its own form of torture. I've always been social, drawing energy from conversations and connections with others. Now I was utterly alone, with nothing but my own thoughts for company. And my thoughts were not kind companions. They ran in circles, obsessing over every possibility, every outcome. Would I be rescued? Would anyone even know I was missing? What did the Colonel want from me? What would he do when he realized I truly didn't have the information he sought? On what I think was the fourth day, they came for me. The door opened without warning. 3 soldiers entered. Before I could react, they had me by the arms, dragging me from the cell. I fought, kicking and screaming, but I might as well have been fighting marble statues for all the good it did. They hauled me down a corridor, my feet barely touching the ground, and into another room. This room was different. It had equipment, a metal chair bolted to the floor, cables and wires, a car battery, tools laid out on a metal table with surgical precision. And standing beside the table, wearing the same immaculate uniform, was the Colonel. "Good morning, Miss Hayes," he said pleasantly, as if we were meeting for tea. "I trust you've had time to reconsider your position?" They forced me into the chair. Leather straps secured my wrists and ankles. I couldn't move, couldn't run, could barely breathe around the panic constricting my chest. "I don't know anything," I said again, but my voice was shaking now. "Please, you have to believe me. I'm just a translator. I don't have any information." The Colonel sighed as if disappointed. He picked up something from the table, I couldn't see what, and moved behind me. "Everyone says that at first," he said conversationally. "But everyone knows something. And we have all the time in the world to extract it." What happened next, I won't describe in detail. Not because I've forgotten. I remember every second with horrifying clarity. But because some things don't need to be relived in their specificity. Pain has a way of being both specific and universal. You can describe the tools, the methods, the techniques, but you can't truly convey the experience of having your humanity stripped away, of being reduced to nothing but nerve endings and screaming. I'll tell you this. I didn't break that first session. Not because I was brave or strong, but because I genuinely didn't have the information they wanted. You can't give what you don't have, no matter how much they hurt you. I think that frustrated the Colonel. He wanted confession, cooperation. Instead, he got only my screams and denials. When they finally stopped and dragged me back to my cell, I couldn't walk. They threw me onto the thin mattress. And I lay there, my body a landscape of pain, wondering if death might be preferable to whatever came next. But here's the thing about human beings that I learned in that cell, in those first terrible days. We're remarkably hard to kill. The body wants to survive. Even when the mind has given up. Even when you're certain you can't endure another moment. The heart keeps beating. The lungs keep breathing. Life persists. The sessions continued. I lost count of how many. Sometimes daily, sometimes with days between. The unpredictability was part of the torture. Never knowing when the door would open, when they would come for me again. Living in constant anticipation of pain is its own unique agony. But something began to change. The Colonel started spending more time with me, talking to me before and after the sessions. At first, I thought it was another technique, a way to build rapport before betraying it with more torture. But gradually, I realized something else was happening. He was fascinated by me. "You're remarkable, Miss Hayes," he said one day, studying me like I was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "Most people break much faster than this. They invent information just to make it stop. But not you. You maintain your story with admirable consistency." I said nothing. I'd learned that silence was sometimes the only form of resistance available to me. "I'm beginning to believe you," he continued. "Not that you're innocent. No one is truly innocent. But that you genuinely don't have the information I was led to believe you possessed." He smiled that terrible smile. Which presents an interesting dilemma. What do I do with you now? I found my voice. Let me go. He laughed, actually laughed. Let you go? Dear girl, you misunderstand the situation entirely. You're mine now. My responsibility. My property, if you will. I can't simply release you. That was the first time he used the word that would come to define my existence for the next months. Property. His toy. His possession. The torture sessions became less frequent, but something worse replaced them. The Colonel began visiting my cell regularly, sometimes multiple times a day. He would bring a chair, sit outside the bars and talk. About his childhood, about the war, about philosophy and politics and literature. He treated me like a captive audience, which of course I was. At first, I refused to engage. I would sit against the far wall, my arms wrapped around my knees, staring at nothing. But isolation does strange things to you. After weeks of having no human contact except during torture sessions, even the Colonel's monologues became a grotesque form of companionship. The human mind craves connection. It's hardwired into us. Solitary confinement isn't just punishment. It's a violation of our fundamental nature. So I began to listen. And eventually, horribly, I began to respond. "You're an educated woman," he said one day. "We could have interesting conversations, you and I. It doesn't have to be like this, me talking, you sulking in the corner like a child. What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice rough from disuse. "I want you to understand," he said. "I want you to see that I'm not a monster. I'm a soldier, doing what's necessary for my country. You torture innocent people." "There are no innocent people in war," he replied calmly. "Everyone is complicit. Everyone makes choices. I didn't choose this. Didn't you?" He leaned forward. "You chose to come to this country. You chose to work with an organization known to have connections with the resistance. You chose to put yourself in harm's way. Actions have consequences, Miss Hayes." These conversations became a regular feature of my captivity. Looking back, I can see them for what they were. Another form of torture, a way to break down my sense of self, to make me complicit in my own captivity by engaging with my captor. Stockholm Syndrome, they call it now, though it was years before that term would be coined. But in those moments, trapped in that cell, those conversations were the only thing keeping me sane. Or perhaps they were the thing driving me mad. It's hard to say. As weeks turned into months, my situation evolved into something I still struggle to put into words. The torture stopped almost entirely. The Colonel moved me from the underground cell to a room on the upper floor. Still locked, still guarded, but with a window, a real bed, books to read. To an outsider, it might have seemed like my situation was improving. But it was worse. So much worse. The Colonel had decided I would be his companion, his project. He called me his toy, sometimes to my face, sometimes to others in my hearing. "Where's my toy today?" he would ask the guards. "How is my toy feeling?" he would inquire, as if I were a pet whose moods were of mild interest. He expected me to dine with him, to sit and make conversation while he ate and drank, and I picked at food I could barely stomach. He brought me books and expected me to discuss them with him. He played music and wanted my opinion on the compositions. He was creating a grotesque parody of a normal relationship, and I was trapped in it. The psychological torture of this was worse than the physical torture had been. With physical pain, there's a clarity to it. You and your tormentor are enemies, the dynamic is simple. But this was confusing, disorienting. He would be kind one moment, cruel the next. He would give me gifts, then remind me that I was his prisoner. He would treat me like a human being, then refer to me as his possession. I became a ghost in my own skin. I learned to dissociate, to separate my mind from what was happening to my body, to my life. When he talked, I would let my consciousness float somewhere else, back to my childhood, to memories of my parents, to imagine futures I would never have. I became expert at being absent while appearing present. But here's what kept me alive. Beneath the dissociation, beneath the numbness I cultivated like armor, there was a core of molten rage. It was small at first, just an ember, but I tended it carefully. Every indignity, every casual cruelty, every time he called me his toy, I fed that rage. I let it grow and burn and sustain me. I began to study him the way he studied me. I watched how he moved, how he thought, what pleased him and what annoyed him. I learned his routines, his habits, his weaknesses. I played the part he wanted, compliant, broken, resigned to my fate. But inside I was planning. The opportunity came in the 5th month. The Colonel had become comfortable with me. Too comfortable. He allowed me more freedom within my locked room. He sometimes left me alone with meals, trusting I wouldn't try anything stupid like attempting to escape or harm myself. He saw me as thoroughly defeated, a toy he'd successfully broken in and trained. He was wrong. I noticed that he took medication. Several types, actually. He had high blood pressure, required pills he took every morning with his coffee. He was methodical about it, never missing a dose. And he kept the medications in his office, in a cabinet he thought was locked but that I'd watched him open often enough to notice the lock was broken. An idea began to form. Slowly, carefully, like a flower blooming in darkness. Understand that what I'm about to describe took months. This wasn't a sudden decision or a moment of opportunity. It was a slow, meticulous process that required patience I didn't know I possessed. First, I needed access to his office. The Colonel often brought me there to sit while he worked, another part of his bizarre need to have me near him. I was furniture, decoration, a living reminder of his power. But furniture can observe. Decoration can plan. I began noting where things were kept. The medication cabinet, yes, but also keys, documents, schedules. I paid attention to when guards changed shifts, which ones were diligent and which ones were lazy. I memorized the layout of the building, every door and corridor I was allowed to see. Second, I needed to change the Colonel's perception of me even more. I needed him to see me as completely harmless, utterly broken. So I became more compliant. I smiled occasionally. I initiated conversations. I pretended interest in his stories. I let him believe he had won. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, that performance. Every smile felt like swallowing poison. Every conversation felt like betraying myself. But I did it because I knew it was my only chance. Third, I needed to learn what would work. I couldn't just dump all his medications into his food. Too obvious, too fast, too likely to be discovered. I needed something that would seem natural, like his heart simply gave out from the stress of war. His blood pressure medication was the key. Too much would cause hypotension, could lead to organ failure that might seem like natural causes in a man under stress. But I also needed other things. I needed him weakened, confused, suffering. I began to think about combinations, about what would happen if I gradually altered his dosages, while also introducing other substances. The compound had a garden. A decorative thing, meant to make this place of horror seem more civilized. And in that garden grew several plants that I recognized from my childhood, from living in different countries, from botanical books I'd read. Oleander, beautiful and deadly. Foxglove with its cardiac glycosides. Lily of the valley, sweetly toxic. I asked permission to walk in the garden. The Colonel, pleased at my apparent acceptance of my situation, agreed. I was accompanied by guards, of course, but guards get bored. They don't watch carefully every moment. Over weeks, I collected small samples. A leaf here, a seed pod there. Nothing obvious, nothing that would be missed. I kept these things hidden in my room, pressed between the pages of books, dried and crushed into powder when I was certain I was unobserved. Slowly, I built my arsenal. The fourth thing I needed was opportunity. And that came in the form of the Colonel's increasing trust. He began allowing me to serve him coffee in the mornings. He enjoyed the domestic ritual of it, I think, the way it made his captive seem like a willing companion. Every morning, I would bring the coffee from the kitchen to his office, where he would take his medications. Every morning, I would watch him swallow his pills, drink his coffee, and begin his day. And every morning, I would plan. I started with small tests. A bit of extra salt in his food to see if he noticed. He didn't. A slightly bitter herb in his coffee. He complained it tasted off but drank it anyway. These were experiments, ways to gauge what I could get away with. Then, 6 months into my captivity, I began in earnest. I started with his blood pressure medication. The pills were large, easy to handle. When I had opportunity, when he left me alone in his office for a few moments, when I could claim I was fetching him documents, I would carefully open the bottle, remove a pill, and replace it with one I'd altered. I'd learned to crush the pills and adjust the dosages. Too much of the active ingredient, mixed with the cardiac glycosides from the foxglove I'd collected. The effects would be gradual. Increasing fatigue, dizziness, confusion. Symptoms that could easily be attributed to stress, to the demands of his position. It worked. Over weeks, I watched the Colonel slowly deteriorate. He complained of tiredness. He began making small mistakes in his work. His temper became more unpredictable. Though perhaps that made my job easier, as people attributed his increasing symptoms to psychological stress rather than anything physical. But I needed more. I needed him truly weakened, incapacitated. So I began adding other things to his food and coffee. Small amounts of the oleander powder, bitter enough that I had to mask it with strong flavors. The lily of the valley, which I crushed into a paste and mixed into sauces. Every day was a calculated risk. Too much, and he would die obviously, suddenly, and there would be an investigation. Too little, and nothing would happen, and I would lose my chance. I walked a razor's edge between patience and action. The colonel's condition worsened. He developed tremors. His speech sometimes slurred. He had episodes of nausea and vomiting. The camp doctor was called in. They ran tests, found nothing conclusive. Perhaps an infection, they thought. Perhaps a parasite. They gave him antibiotics, which I knew would do nothing. I should have felt guilty. I should have questioned what I was doing, worried about my own morality, my own soul. But I felt nothing except a cold, clear determination. This man had tortured me. He had stolen months of my life, had tried to break my spirit, had called me his toy and treated me like an object. Whatever happened to him, he had earned. In the 7th month of my captivity, the colonel's condition became critical. He could barely leave his bed. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor. His breathing was labored. The camp doctor wanted to evacuate him to a proper hospital, but the colonel refused. Too proud, too paranoid that his enemies would learn of his weakness. That pride would kill him. I continued my careful poisoning, adjusting dosages as his body weakened, knowing that what had taken weeks to build up would soon reach its conclusion. I was with him often now, playing the role of concerned companion. The guards and other officers saw me as his devoted toy, caring for him in his illness. No one suspected. "Eleanor," he said to me one day, his voice weak. "You've been good to me during this. I may have been too harsh with you before. When I recover, things will be different." I smiled and brought him water mixed with more poison. "I'm sure they will, Colonel." He died 3 days later. When the colonel died, there was chaos. An autopsy was ordered, but in a military camp in the middle of a war, medical resources were limited. The doctor noted heart failure, likely brought on by stress, and an underlying cardiac condition that had been previously undiagnosed. The symptoms all fit. No one suspected poison. No one suspected me. But I knew I had to escape. With the colonel dead, I had no protector. Other officers might decide I was too much of a risk to keep alive, a witness to things I shouldn't have seen. Or they might simply let me rot in that room forever, forgotten in the chaos of war. The day after the colonel's death, as the camp was in turmoil making arrangements for his funeral and transfer of command, I made my move. I'd been planning my escape route for months, just as carefully as I'd planned the poisoning. I knew which guard was most susceptible to being distracted. I knew which doors were typically left unlocked during shift changes. I knew where the weapons were stored, where vehicles were kept, and which direction led toward the nearest territory not controlled by the colonel's army. I waited until nightfall. The guard outside my door was new, young, nervous about being alone after the colonel's death. I called out that I was sick, that I needed help. When he opened the door to check on me, I was ready. I'd saved some of the oleander paste. Not much, just enough. I'd mixed it into a cup of the guard's coffee earlier when I'd been allowed to move around the building. He'd already drunk it hours ago. Now, as he leaned in to see what was wrong with me, the poison hit him hard. He stumbled, went pale, gasped for breath. I didn't wait to see what happened. I ran. The compound was in disarray. People were focused on the colonel's death, on the political implications, on who would take command. A young woman running through the corridors didn't register as immediately threatening. By the time someone shouted, I was already out a side door. I'd stolen clothing. A soldier's uniform that was too large but would help me blend in the darkness. I'd taken what money I could find in the colonel's office days before. I ran into the night, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode, but I didn't stop. I made it to the treeline before I heard the first gunshots. They were shooting blindly into the darkness, unsure where I'd gone. I ran deeper into the forest, branches tearing at my face and arms, my lungs burning, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I walked through that forest for 2 days, drinking from streams, eating nothing, driven by pure survival instinct. When I finally stumbled across a village, I was more ghost than human, filthy, exhausted, half-starved. But I was free. The organization I'd worked for eventually found me. They helped me get back to America, though the details of that journey are still classified, still tangled up in the secret wars that no one wants to acknowledge happened. They offered me counseling, which I refused. They offered me money, which I accepted because I needed to survive. They asked me to never speak about what happened, and for 60 years, I honored that request. Until today. I never married. How could I? How could I let anyone close enough to see the scars, both visible and invisible, that I carried? How could I explain the nightmares, the moments when I would dissociate, floating away from my own body, because that's what I'd learned to do to survive? I built a quiet life. I became a librarian, spending my days with books instead of people, finding peace in the ordered world of stories and information. I changed my name, changed my appearance, became someone new. Eleanor Hayes died in that prison cell. The woman who emerged was someone else entirely. Do I regret poisoning the Colonel? No. Not even a little bit. I sleep better knowing he's dead by my hand than I ever did when he was alive. Does that make me a monster? Perhaps. But he made me what I am. He tried to break me, to reduce me to nothing more than his toy. And instead he created something that could fight back. I think about him sometimes, usually late at night when sleep won't come. I don't think about the poisoning or the escape. I think about those conversations we had, when he was trying to break me down psychologically. He told me once that everyone has it in them to be a monster, that the only difference between him and me was that he was honest about what he was. Maybe he was right. Maybe I am a monster. Maybe we all have that capacity within us, just waiting for the right circumstances to bring it out. But here's what I've learned in the 80 years I've been alive. Being a monster to survive is different from being a monster because you enjoy it. I did what I had to do. The Colonel did what he wanted to do. That's the difference. I'm telling this story now because I'm old, and death doesn't frighten me anymore. I'm telling it because I want people to know what happened in those secret wars. In those places where international law was just a suggestion, where human rights were abandoned at the door. I'm telling it because for too long, survivors like me have been silent, and silence serves only those who commit atrocities. But mostly, I'm telling it because I want other survivors to know they're not alone. If you're listening to this, if you've experienced something similar, please know this. Survival is not shameful. Doing what you had to do to live is not wrong. You are not broken beyond repair. You are not less than human for what was done to you, or for what you did to survive. The Colonel tried to make me his toy. In the end, I made myself free. And that after all these years, after all this time, is the only justice I ever needed. My story ends here, but perhaps yours is just beginning. Perhaps you're listening because you have your own story of survival, your own battles fought in silence. Or perhaps you're here to bear witness, to understand what humans are capable of enduring and overcoming. Whatever brought you here today, I want to thank you for listening. For sitting with me through these difficult memories, for allowing an old woman to finally speak her truth after 60 years of silence. If this story moved you, if it meant something to you, I would be deeply grateful if you would leave a like on this video. Not for me, I'm 80 years old. What do I care about internet popularity? But because every like helps this story reach another person who might need to hear it. Another survivor who feels alone. Another person struggling to understand what happened to them. Your like becomes a beacon for them to find their way here. And please, I'm asking you from the bottom of my heart, leave a comment below. Tell me your thoughts. Share your own story if you're ready. Anonymously is perfectly fine. Tell me what resonated with you, what questions you have, what parts made you angry or sad or hopeful. I may be old, but I still read every single comment. Your words matter. Your voice matters. For too long, voices like ours have been silenced. Let's break that silence together. Finally, if you believe this story deserves to be heard by more people, please subscribe to this channel. There are other stories like mine waiting to be told. Stories of survival, of resilience, of ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when they needed it most. By subscribing, You become part of a community that refuses to forget, that honors the truth, that stands with survivors. The subscribe button is right there below this video. The like button is right beside it. And the comment section is waiting for your voice. Don't let my story end in silence. Help me spread it. Help others find it. Help us build a world where survivors are believed, where truth is honored, where no one has to carry their burden alone for 60 years like I did. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring enough to make it to the end. Now go ahead. Like, comment, subscribe. Let's make sure stories like mine are never forgotten.